Hello, everybody, and welcome. We are so excited to have you here with us today for episode 143 of ASBN Live. On behalf of the American Sustainable Business Network, I'm Tulasi Sivalingam, the Senior Manager of Events and Programming, and I'm excited for this conversation between two visionary business leaders. George Serafeim is the Charles M. Williams Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School, where he co-leads the Impact Weighted Accounts Project and the Climate and Sustainability Impact AI. He has presented his research in over 60 countries around the world and ranks among the top 10 most popular authors out of over 12,000 business authors on the Social Science Research Network. His book, Purpose and Profit: How Business Can Lift Up the World, is available now. I'll be dropping the link for the book in the chat throughout the webinar. George will be interviewed by Jeffrey Hollender, ASBN CEO and co-founder of the American Sustainable Business Network. He was co-founder and CEO of Seventh Generation, which he built into a leading natural product brand known for its authenticity, transparency, and progressive business practices. Jeffrey, it's now my pleasure to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Tulasi. And George, we're just thrilled to have you. The last webinar you did with us, Revolutionizing Accounting, is often visited on our website. And I'm so happy we're getting to chat today. So I wanted to start by asking you a question about your wonderful and actually very hopeful book, Purpose and Profit, which presents a quite positive perspective on the changes you see taking place, specifically with regard to the sustainability impact of larger companies. And I'm wondering if you can share some of the highlights that have led you to this hopeful perspective.
Yeah. First of all, Jeffrey, thank you very much for having me again. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you and the broader network. I believe the last time we had a webinar, it was maybe the beginning of COVID or right before COVID. COVID also made us lose track of time a little bit, but it has been a couple of years, so it's always a pleasure to be here with you. And you're absolutely right that actually I have an optimistic view about the future, and what really gives me a great sense of optimism is the students that I see, to be honest with you, every year going through the classrooms, hundreds of them, not in some cases, thousands of them, and wanting to do more about the world and wanting to do better about the world. And I think a fundamental change that has happened, Jeffrey, as well, is that a lot more young people are wanting to think in terms of and rather than or. And that is a fundamental difference that I think we view pretty significantly happening in the business place. And of course, traditionally, everybody sees the world in terms of or. For example, you say, oh, I want, for example, an electric vehicle, but traditionally people would think about it as, well, electrification, and as a result, declines in emissions or performance, electrification or design. And suddenly, basically, innovators come and they say electrification and performance, right? And I'm sure that that was the story as well of when you created Seventh Generation, right? Where a lot of people are saying, well, those products need to be effective and so forth, or they need to be environmentally more sustainable. And suddenly, entrepreneurs like yourself, they said, hold on a second, and, right? How we can actually create that? And I think a lot of that thinking is actually now embedded in the process mindset of young people that want to actually do better. But no, I would say part of what I describe in the book as well is not only young people, it's actually people in the mid of their careers or even more seasoned executives that want to actually take a step back and ask the question, why are we doing things the way we're doing things, and why we cannot actually do things different? And of course, that different perspective, one of the things that I describe in the book as well, is that it's not easy, right? It's not somehow that coupling purpose and profit is somehow easy. And in many cases, actually, it leads to failures. It's a challenging perspective, and it leads also many people to assume more risk, more organizational risk, but also more personal career risk. But at the same time, it's a very rewarding one. So when you ask me what makes me optimistic about the future, I think it's an incredible amount of energy that is going on inside starting new companies, becoming managers and operators in existing companies, having conviction about allocating capital to those disruptive companies and improving the world. So that makes me, I would say, very hopeful about the future and about our ability to actually create a better world.
So when you think about that optimism, are there some large companies who we might not normally think of that are taking some leadership initiatives with regard to purpose and sustainability?
I think the first thing to recognize, Jeffrey, is that all organizations, and that's how I always frame it, all organizations have both positive and negative impact, right? I cannot think probably of any organization that is completely free of any negative impacts or completely free from any positive impacts. So the question is always, how do you establish a baseline? How do you establish a baseline about where we are right now? And then how do you have actually a credible action plan about how you can improve? And by that, improvement means mitigating your negative impacts and actually magnifying your positive impacts. And as part of that, I think there are two things worth thinking about. The first one is how scalable are your efforts and how sustainable are your efforts from the perspective of durability, right? And that's where actually the click with profit is happening, because in many cases, if actually you cannot find business practices that are able to be profitable, then it's hard actually to scale them up, and it's hard to sustain them over long periods of time. And I think from that perspective, I tend to think about impact in very broad terms, right? So when you think, for example, about an organization like Apple, for me, where I have, for example, a large part of my family living on a different continent, Apple has a revolutionized impact for me, because I can actually talk to my family for zero cost and I can see them all the time. That has created an enormous social value actually from that perspective. And then when you're thinking about some of the work that they have been doing on the supply chain, on end-of-life management, on recyclability, on the types of materials that are going into, they have actually created pretty significant actually impact. And I think the same thing can be applied to many other organizations, even some of the organizations that we wouldn't traditionally tend to think about it this way, right? Another example that I give sometimes is almost a very counterintuitive example, which is many mining firms. And of course, mining has a tremendous amount of negative impact because of the waste that is generated around the mines, which is really, really significant, other social effects and environmental effects. But at the same time, we need actually in the 21st century, very, very significant amount of mining, because we need to somehow basically procure that and direct that for the energy transition. The energy transition will require a great amount of actually minerals and metals that we will need when we're thinking about lithium and nickel and cobalt and copper and so forth. So as we're thinking about that, the question is for all organizations, can we actually align with where the world needs to go from a societal perspective in terms of reducing our emissions, reducing the negative environmental impacts that we're having, while at the same time deploying the innovative and the agile spirit of business to create solutions. And of course, that probably is going to be accelerated if we have supportive policies, right? And supportive regulations and a supportive policy environment that actually rewards positive impact and disincentivizes the negative impacts, right? And we can have a long discussion about that, but that is not currently the environment that we are necessarily living in.
So in chapter 3 of your terrific new book, it would be wonderful to have you share some of the work that you've been doing over the past few years talking about those externalities, and you've done some really groundbreaking work on impact-weighted accounting and the effect these externalities have on society and the environment. Of great interest is your finding that companies would lose on average 15% of their profits if they had to account for their environmental externalities. Can you unpack that a little bit and explain to people what that work is about and what you learned from it?
Totally. So, Jeffrey, if you actually take a step back, right, and you actually think about the world that we're living right now, we take as granted the idea that actually we have a performance evaluation and measurement system that records profit for all companies. And that is the accounting system that we have built over decades. And of course, if you go back in history to ancient Mesopotamia and so forth, you find a financial accounting system running for thousands of years. And in the modern manifestation of this, there's a financial reporting system that is running for close to 100 years now, a little bit less than that. And we have accepted it from the perspective of how do we measure success inside an organization, right? And we say, well, if you are profitable, and we calculate the return on equity and return on assets, and we say that is success. But at the same time, we're not measuring actually in any systematic way the different negative and positive impacts that organizations create. Let me give you two examples of that. On the negative side, for example, we're not really measuring in many ways how many carbon emissions all organizations are creating, although that more recently is on the uprise, and certainly we're not valuing those impacts, right? So we're not saying actually that on the one side, you might have generated 50 million of profit, but at the same time, you have generated 20 million of damages from environmental costs, for example. So one of the things that we're doing with the impact-weighted accounts, we're trying to actually think about how do we derive a success metric that takes into account those types of positive and negative impacts, right? And as a result, one of the things that we do, for example, and you just quoted this metric, is we have looked at actually when you take into account the carbon emissions of a company, even if you restrict it to the scope 1 and 2 emissions, and you say, well, actually, if you take those carbon emissions and you multiply with the social cost of carbon that you can calculate, then what is the environmental damage that you have created? So then you can compare the profit of the company against its environmental damage that is creating. And one of the things that you see is that for many companies, actually a large part of that profit is wiped out if those companies had to pay for the environmental damage that they're creating. The same thing we're doing when it comes, for example, to diversity and inclusion. You actually hear a lot of organizations saying, well, we're becoming more diverse. But in our data, when we looked at that and you say, well, actually, if you compare the demographics of a company relative to the demographics of the local population, and you actually calculate, let's call them the missed wages of the underrepresented populations, on average in our sample for any given year, that's about 170 million, basically, in wages. That is a very, very significant amount of money for underrepresented populations that haven't been able to enter the labor force and actually get that on average on the large company, right? So then you multiply that across all companies and you say, wow, that is actually a huge amount of actually missed wages that people might be having from underrepresented populations in the workforce. And of course, then we're actually looking on the positive side of things, right? So you can actually offer products and services, you can create jobs and so forth that have tremendous amount of positive impacts. But I think if we truly want to move to an economic system that actually incentivizes the generation of more positive impacts on people on the planet and disincentivizes the generation of negative impacts, we need to actually start measuring how much those impacts are in order then to create both a business environment, but also a policy environment that moves us forward towards actually thinking about those impacts, not as part of the periphery of the organization, but actually a core part of how do we design products and services? How do we design operations that we're trying to mitigate the negative impacts and magnify the positive impacts? And let me also say, Jeffrey, that this doesn't mean that we're going to get it exactly right? And this doesn't mean that we're going to be able to actually create a perfect system, or it doesn't mean that we're going to generate a system that actually it removes all negative impacts and magnifies all positive. It's going to be a balance, right? Even when you think about something like the transition to net zero, which is going to be very challenging, right? But there's a reason why we call it net zero, because we know that we cannot actually remove all carbon emissions from the world. And as a result, we're looking for negative emission technologies, either in the context of nature-based solutions or technological solutions, such as carbon capture and use or storage, right? So we're thinking about those things, but I think there is a tremendous amount of opportunity for us to actually think about why we do things this way. And as a result, we should be questioning ourselves and unleashing a new wave of innovation and creativity in the 21st century, and importantly, empowering people that are willing to actually question, why do we do things the way we do, and maybe we should be doing things very, very differently.
That's fascinating, George. How many companies have you been able to evaluate, and is there somewhere that people could see the result of those evaluations?
Totally. For anybody, everything is open access that we have done on our web page on Impact Weighted Accounts project at the Harvard Business School. We have been able to produce, for example, an environmental data set that has about close to 3,000 companies, a little bit less than that, depending on the year, for the last 10 years, and we have been able to calculate their environmental impact on the negative side of things, and then on the employment impact side of things, we have been able to calculate that, again, close to about 3,000 large companies for about 10 years going back in history. And of course, the number of companies over time is increasing as we're having better disclosure, and calculate their positive employment impact from the jobs that they're creating and so forth. And all the data is widely accessible and open access. And on the product side of things, because that's another area that we have been working on trying to understand when you are selling different types of products, how those are impacting the customers and the environment around us. And we have been able to produce a data set of about 200 companies, if I remember correctly. And of course, the lower number of that is because product impact tends to be quite idiosyncratic across different industries. Of course, if you are selling financial services versus selling cereal versus selling cars, then you have very different types of impacts. So we have been producing their industry templates, assessing the issues such as access and affordability, quality of products, and so forth. When it comes to that, but everything is open access and everybody can engage. And also, let me say, Jeffrey, again, that this is a version 1. Over time, we will keep improving them, and every performance evaluation and performance metric system has this feature. This is not a bug of the system. This is a feature of the system, that you build something and then you can keep improving, which is fundamentally the story of the financial accounting system. It used to be that we didn't account for pensions. It used to be that we didn't account for the operating leases and so forth. And it used to be that we used to recognize revenues in probably inefficient ways, and not ways that truly reflect the underlying business reality of business. And over time, we're improving. So we're creating those infrastructures, we are engaging with people, and over time, they will be improving.
Terrific. Thank you for that. George is someone who really makes accounting interesting, and central to the analysis and the work that he does. On a somewhat different but related note, you could say that a war has erupted over the use of ESG metrics, and there is a tremendous amount of controversy. Do you have a sense of what's going on there, why there is so much controversy about these metrics, and where this will lead?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, Jeffrey, having witnessed this whole space over longer periods of time, right? There are many people that are entering this space a little bit more recently, and as a result, they witness the status quo. But I do remember, Jeffrey, and you remember it as well, having been in the space for a long time, where nobody cared actually about these metrics, right? And actually, the fact that there is controversy, I think is actually a good thing. It means that at least people care, actually, and apparently they care quite a bit. And as a result, the metrics and the performance evaluations are actually really affecting decision making, it seems to be. And as a result, having that conversation is a good thing. Now, what is causing the controversy? I think there are a couple of things there. I think the first one is misunderstanding and misconceptions. Sometimes people are talking past each other. And as a result, I think as with every growing field, there's a lot of noise that gets created around it. I think the second part to that is that sometimes there are interests that are feeding on the noise, meaning that this is very beneficial for a lot of people to create noise. You create a lot of controversy, and as we witness quite often, whenever you go on Twitter, that is actually something that many people like, and it feeds actually into the identities of many people. So I think that's part of it as well. And of course, there's a lot of controversy, but that is not necessarily about ESG broadly. It's really about fossil fuels, right? And I think there is a lot of controversy because specifically when we're looking as part of the E in ESG, and even more specifically, not so much about other types of environmental issues, but really about carbon emissions from fossil fuels, right? And a lot of people are worried about the competitiveness of the fossil fuel industry and about their ability to finance operations and move those businesses forward. While other people are kind of like saying we shouldn't be doing that, right? And I think there's quite a bit of controversy. Quite specifically, it doesn't have to do that much about ESG, is really under the E and under a specific part of the E. So I think that is another element that is going on. And I think fundamentally also there is also I would say the bigger, broader question that sometimes you hear in this conversation, which is, should it be the role of the business to be even thinking about those environmental, social, and governance issues? And I think my response to that is that I think, and that's one of the things that I describe in the book, is that over time, many of those environmental, social, and governance issues have become important drivers of competitiveness of companies. And as a result, you need to be thinking about them just from the perspective of good management and good governance. And of course, for many, actually, I think companies, and as part of their culture and as part of their purpose, has become also an important element to be thinking about the impact that they're having. But I think when you're thinking about issues, for example, of talent attraction, talent retention, thinking about issues of diversity and inclusion have become very, very important in many industries of the economy. And when you're thinking about, for example, environmental issues such as carbon emissions has become extremely important for companies in the transportation sector, given changes in technology and given changes in regulation, for energy companies, for chemical companies, and so forth. So different of those issues have become important drivers of competitiveness. And that's why whenever there is a conversation saying, oh, is this going to be something that goes away and people are not going to be discussing about sustainability issues in the business anymore 10 years from now and so forth? My answer is that I don't think so. I think there are pretty structural changes that are happening. And because of changes in regulation, changes in technologies, changes in market demand and so forth, this is a pretty structural change. And as a result, my belief is that management teams that are able to adapt, better measure performance on ESG issues, better analyze performance on ESG issues, develop the management and governance processes to drive performance and improvements on those issues, and then to credibly and authentically communicate their performance of those issues, are going to position their companies to be more competitive in the future. You're on mute, Jeff.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, sorry about that. One of the fascinating things you note in the book is that Unilever has a group of sustainable living brands, of which Seventh Generation is one. And you note that those sustainable living brands grew 69% faster than the rest of their brand portfolio. What do you think's going on here that's driving that superior performance?
I think there are a couple of elements that are going on, right? I think one of the things that I described in the book is that technology has really changed the way that we think about basically value inside the organizations. And technology has generated two effects. The first one, it has increased in general transparency around the world, right? So if you were going back a few decades ago and you were saying, what is, for example, the impact of this product or this brand on the world, rightly so, people would say, I have no idea. And now there are even consumer apps that you can go to the supermarket and scan a barcode and see, actually have transparency about the extent to which that product or that brand might be more positive or more negative for the environment or for consumers or for human health and so forth. So I think technology has pretty much expanded the information set that we have, and that is actually allowing for that information set to enter into the choices that people are making, not only in product markets as consumers, but also in labor markets. One of the things that I observe repeatedly among my own students is that, you know, they want to work for a company that stands for something positive, that stands for something that is actually contributing in a positive way to the world. So I think that the transparency effect is very, very real. The other effect that has happened because of technology, and I described, is it has expanded choice. It has expanded the set of choices that people have, both for actually in product markets, but also in labor markets, right? And if you look at, for example, employment choices a few decades ago, people will try to talk to a few of their friends and to read the newspaper and try to find what is the different job opportunities that exist. But now, because of the presence of platforms such as LinkedIn and Indeed and so forth, that actually has expanded your choice set. And that is important. And by the way, the same thing for products, right? I remember a time where I would go to the supermarket and there were two cereal, right? And I didn't have an option. It was just one brand. And now you actually have so many of them, right? And the same thing for many actually products out there. So I think that is important, because if I have information, if I know which companies are having a more positive or which brands are having more positive or more negative impact, but I don't have choice, then it doesn't matter, actually, in many ways. I will just buy that product because I don't have like a lot of choice. But because of technology, both transparency and choice has expanded. And of course, that has enabled more people to either vote with their career choices or to vote with their wallets as consumers and so forth. And increasingly, that is affecting the value of organizations. Why it's affecting the value of organization? Because most of the value now in organizations is coming from their human capital, social capital, meaning the trust that they enjoy in society, intellectual capital in terms of the creativity and innovation in organizations. So as that choice is basically exercised through voice and the choices that people are making, it's actually affecting value inside the organization. So I think that is a pretty fundamental change that is happening throughout basically many sectors. And of course, it manifests in different ways in different sectors of the economy. Sometimes it's easier to see it in business to consumer types of settings, but also actually it manifests in business to business sometimes settings. One of the examples that sometimes I give, one of the cases that I wrote, and when I asked the large automobile manufacturer, why are you doing all this work on sustainability? They said, well, because a large part of our sales are to corporate customers, and now corporate customers are actually have specific policies about the environmental profile of our products. And that is actually changing behavior right, in many ways. So again, it will manifest in different ways in different industries and different sectors of the economy. But I think there is a pretty fundamental change that is happening that has been driven because of technology. And of course, when you couple that with changing values in society, with really, really important and visible problems that we observe around us, such as climate change and so forth, it's creating a pretty structural change in how different brands and different products might perform over time. You're on mute, Jeffrey.
Sorry, there's some construction going on next to me, so I keep muting my voice. One of the things that you mentioned is that today, 80% of the market value of the average company is represented by intangible assets. So rather than inventory and real estate and all of the hard assets that we're so familiar with, companies now mostly have intangible assets. How do you protect those intangible assets? You can't necessarily buy insurance to protect your brand.
Right, right. It's to me, this is actually really central to the whole sustainability and ESG discussion, because actually when you think about it, what are those, right? I just mentioned before that I think for many actually companies, it's their ability to actually rely on people, human capital, on creating productive environments and productive teams. So they create intellectual capital inside the organization, and then they create great products and services that people trust and people want to buy, and that is in the form of social capital, right? And of course, for depending on the industry that you are in many ways, actually relying on important natural capital that is actually critical for the organizations, and making sure that you don't have significant negative impacts on that natural capital. So when you're actually thinking about it from that perspective, it makes tons of sense that those issues are core business issues, and as a result, that you need to have a management and a governance process in any organization to drive performance forward, and think about a couple of those issues. So as those types of capital are becoming more important drivers of value, of course, all of those things are not necessarily things that we recognize as part of a balance sheet, right? And as you say, you need to nourish them, you need to protect them, and you need to develop them over time. And I think that goes also to the point that of almost like thinking about a life cycle perspective on many of those things, as we tend to think about, for example, life cycle analysis when it comes to the environmental space, and we tend to think about, okay, from the point of extraction to production to sales to end of life management, we need to be thinking actually about other forms of capital in exactly the same way, right? So many people, for example, might look at the employees actually from the perspective of who are we hiring, but that is only the beginning, in my opinion, right? And we need to have the same career cycle analysis as well that is happening when we're thinking actually about human intellectual capital. And it's all about, are you providing opportunity for people to be hired, right? And where that opportunity is coming from, and are you providing opportunity to a wider set of the population, or both from a geographic location basis, but also from an identity basis. And then are you having actually opportunity to be compensated fairly? Compensated fairly from the perspective of what other people are earning, right? So equal pay for equal job and equal occupation, but also from the perspective of what actually people might need from the perspective of local living wages and so forth. And then having the opportunity to actually be well inside the organization, both from a safety perspective, but also from a workplace environment perspective. And then the opportunity to, of course, get promoted and advance their career and grow their careers. So I think for organizations to really protect those intangible assets, they need to actually adopt this almost like life cycle when we're thinking about environment, but also career cycle perspective when we're thinking about people, and how you can actually grow some of those intangible assets and generate great value, but also great impact.
Thank you, George. One of the other things that you highlight is that we need leaders that really care about making the world a better place. What do we do with leaders that don't care?
Jeffrey, it's a great question. I don't know. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because, as you know, I think it's towards the end of the book, it's the 8th chapter, where I say, we can have this discussion forever about how those issues are becoming important. But what I hear many times is that this is so hard. And I give this example in the context of a discussion between CEOs of large companies, where they were complaining about how hard it is to measure many of those issues, and then align the organization to improve performance around those issues, and how there are difficult trade-offs that one needs to make. And then one of the CEOs said, actually, the underlying problem is not necessarily that it's hard. Yes, I agree, it's hard. But the problem is that you don't care enough, actually. And that is the underlying problem. Because if you cared enough, you would say, as everything else in business that is actually difficult, acquiring customers, right? Hiring great people, producing a great product, and so getting the financing, you would actually move forward with this. The problem is that you don't care enough. And I think that caring aspect is extremely important when we're thinking about that. And to me, that connects to purpose, because purpose to me is all about alignment and accountability inside an organization. And when you're actually being able to create an organization that everybody is aligned behind a common set of purpose, and everybody is accountable about whether that organization is achieving that purpose, then you actually end up really significant effects in terms of people working very hard to achieve that purpose, and not seeing just trade-offs as a static issue, but actually as a dynamic issue, something that we can actually change over time through our operations, through our product design, and everything that we're creating. And to me, that is a critical component, Jeffrey, that we actually have leaders that actually care, that are bold, that are saying, look, I understand that the past is not going to be the future, and as a result, I'm willing to take a risk and do things differently. But I think the caring part is an important part of the conversation.
You identify in your book 4 pillars of sustainable behavior, and one of the ones that you focus on is about public policy. What needs to happen from a public policy perspective to accelerate the transition of companies becoming more responsible and sustainable?
Yeah, and it's a very important discussion, Jeffrey. And one of the things that I mentioned in the book is that, of course, from a policy perspective, a lot of things could happen, but I'm not a policy expert. So, so one of the things that I concentrate and I highlight is that I think it's critically important that policymakers and governments safeguard the quality of the information that we're all getting. And I think that is a very, very important element, especially in the context of a lot of noise, misinformation that's happening, and we see that increasingly also around the world. Because if we don't have good information, then we cannot have actually accountability in a society. And if we don't have accountability, then we cannot have meritocracy actually in society. So even going back to what we're discussing before, if we want to empower consumers to make better choices, if we want to empower employees to choose organizations that are having a more positive impact, if we want to empower investors to allocate capital in organizations that are truly creating solutions, all of that actually depends on the quality of the information that exists out there. So I think it's really critically important that we have policies that safeguard the quality of the information, and they produce more higher signal and less noise from that perspective.
Terrific. So we have a number of questions that have come in from people who are listening to us, and I just want to read you a couple of those questions and let you respond to them. Bernard asks, what companies are exemplars from who we can all learn, and which research and or consulting organizations are leading the work on environmental economics shared value?
Yeah, I mean, on shared value, there's a whole shared value initiative actually that exists around the world. I just spoke actually in one of their events in Australia with very, very significant work that has been happening in the country there as well. And I think everywhere around the world, the amazing thing that really actually is very inspiring to me when you go to different countries around the world, how institutions have developed that are really embedding actually those sustainability issues within their local context, because the way that they manifest is very different, right? It's very different when you go to South Africa, it's very different when you go to Chile, it's very different around the world, because it depends really on the local context and the local conditions. For example, when you go to Chile, issues of, for example, how do you think about the energy transition and lithium and so forth, and how do you think about governance issues have become extremely important. Of course, in South Africa, issues of actually economic representation across different races is an issue that is extremely, extremely important. So I think embedding that in the local context and then thinking about the role of business in creating shared value is actually a really, really important space. And I would say overall, you know, in the book, I describe several actually examples of organizations that have been able to deliver actually great impact and great value. And the amazing thing to me about that is that it ranges from all kinds of like at the small level organization to very large scale organizations, some of them that we mentioned before. In the book as well, I provide two examples of former students of mine. One of them that created a venture capital firm that broadened access to capital, entrepreneurs that have been underrepresented in terms of funding from the venture capital industry. And another former student of mine that provided increased access to opportunity for employment for underrepresented groups as well, by creating a technology and media platform with very significant effects, actually. So you observe that effect happening more and more, but we need to actually channel and fuel that type of entrepreneurship everywhere around the world. And I think it's happening. The positive thing is that I think it's happening. And sometimes we can say, well, it's happening not fast enough, not at the scale that we all want, and so forth, especially in the context of some very, very significant and urgent problems such as climate change, but it is happening. And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind and find inspiration in that and move forward. And all of us exercising the agency that exists in all of us to accelerate that journey. And as you know, Jeffrey, that is a key part of the book, actually, the fact that independent of where we are as entrepreneurs, as managers, as operators, as investors, and so forth, when you're actually thinking about the full spectrum of business, there is more or less, depending on where you are in the career cycle that you're in, but there is agency in all of us to actually create impact.
Thank you. Another listener wrote in and said, what types of federal and state incentives should be created to reward companies to become more proactive around climate solutions?
I think the Inflation Reduction Act is a significant move forward from that, from the perspective of policies. And of course, I think we're going to see pretty significant effects, even when you're thinking actually about the very basic things that we need to change, such as, for example, homes everywhere around the US are extremely actually carbon intensive when you think about it from the perspective of air conditioning and heating and so forth. We need to change all of those things. And I think having the types of regulations and policies that are going to incentivize people to actually buy the type of equipment that will produce lower carbon emissions and shift more towards electricity, I think it's important. I think something that everybody pretty much agrees is that we need to electrify a whole lot of things. And of course, at the same time, the grid needs to become lower carbon over time. That is not going to happen within like the next week or even within the next 2 or 3 years. It will be a transition and it will take some time. But I think in general, policies, both at the state and at the federal level, that both incentivize electrification of things and they're shifting the grid over time to have a lower carbon intensity are going to be extremely important. I also think we need to pretty significantly incentivize the generation installment of batteries. Although they're not going to be a silver bullet for everything, it's very, very significant actually development, and scaling up and bringing the cost of batteries is going to be extremely important when we're thinking about that. And of course, I do think still that we have a tremendous amount of things that we can do in terms of efficiency and improving our efficiency as well when it comes to energy and so forth. So I think that is also a very, very important component. But I think thinking about all the everyday choices that people can have, and I think also having the lens of how we can actually target things that can change faster. The carbon benefit comes earlier rather than later, because there is almost a time value of carbon, right? So the more we cut today is more valuable than cutting the same amount 5 years from now. So we need to be thinking also about what is it that we can incentivize for people to actually do today.
What do you think about a carbon tax? I mean, should that be something that we put in place to disincentivize carbon pollution?
You know, that has been for a long time the preferred solution from economists. And everybody, I think, not everybody, but there's a lot of agreement among economists that this would be the most optimal way of shifting the economy, because then you impose a carbon tax and then you allow market forces to basically work and find the best solutions, given the fact that you're going to price carbon emissions as an externality. But it seems to be that this is not something that is politically feasible. This is what I hear and I read all the time, that somehow this is not politically feasible within the US context. But certainly from just a pure economics perspective, a lot of people would say that this would have been optimal, because it would have allowed for the market to basically start creating solutions that price carbon as an externality. So it would have been a great solution. Again, it doesn't seem to be that people are basically the decision makers, which is the policy makers, are moving towards that solution.
Another listener writes in that in terms of capital and measurement, do you have an opinion about measuring the life cycle benefits versus the costs of solar power, given the impact of mining and the difficulty to recycle the waste?
We should absolutely be measuring those things, right? And a good example is one of the cases that I teach here is around batteries, for example, right? And for example, batteries are an incredible thing because, you know, they can create actually the electrification mega wave that we're experiencing in transportation and so forth. But at the same time, to generate batteries, you need a whole lot of electricity. And if that electricity is coming from coal, there's a lot of carbon emissions. And at the same time, we need to find a way to recycle some of those batteries, because the mining of the rare materials is extremely carbon intensive as well. So we need to actually think about upstream effects. We need to think about downstream effects. Nothing, as a result, if we want to really understand how much we are decarbonizing the economy and not having carbon leakage, either on the supply chain side of things or from an end-of-life management side of things. We need to be actually measuring some of those impacts as well.
Someone else writes in, how does professional education need to change to meet the challenges we're facing? Do we need radical change or can we achieve it incrementally?
It's a great question. And I think when we're thinking about professional education, of course, being here at Harvard Business School, in a school that is a graduate school that is around business administration. And I think the way that you can think about it is at least in two ways. The first one is you can actually try and create specifically courses around sustainability issues. Or the other one would be to try and embed in all courses the management and governance of sustainability issues, right? And I think there are almost like benefits and benefits and disadvantages to either approach, right? So the second approach, although it can be extremely powerful because it actually integrates those issues into all management decisions that somebody needs to make and all business decisions that needs to make, at the same time can be slower, right? Because it requires actually the coordination of so many actually different actors and decision makers within an educational institution. But at the same time, the first approach, it can be much faster, but actually it highlights again the siloed effect. This is somehow different, right? So overall, I think the first approach is probably a bridge to getting to the second approach, which is integration in all actually professional courses. So when you are thinking about a management issue, when you're thinking about a marketing issue, when you're thinking about an organizational behavior issue, when you're thinking about an accounting issue or a finance issue, you're actually thinking about all of those issues, actually all the sustainability issues as part of what you're doing. I think it's going to be a journey, and we need to actually have people that can think in terms of systems as well, right? Not thinking about point solutions, but actually can think about the systemic effects that are being created and the fact that when you are doing something, there are feedback loops that are operating, either reinforcing or detracting from what you're trying to do. And I think that can only be achieved if we have integration throughout everything that we're teaching in business schools, in professional schools in general.
Susan wrote in and said, the elephant in the room is growth, the belief that we need perpetual growth. What are your thoughts on that subject?
I think it's an important discussion to have, but I think it's also growth where and for what, right? And I think that is really, really important to say, because if you actually go to many of the emerging markets and say, do not grow, I think that is one, deeply unfair, and two, actually deeply not realistic about where those countries need to go. They have to grow quite a bit, and they have to actually improve the living standards for a large number of people in those countries. And so I think it's a perspective about growth where. I think it's really important, and thinking about the emerging market context is very, very important. And the second element is growth for what, right? What kind of growth? And I think we can actually have a really important debate about how we can actually have growth that is not having a disastrous effect on the planet, right? And I think that is also the perspective of that I think policymakers could adopt, right? When we're thinking about incentivizing the types of positive impacts that we need and disincentivize the type of negative impact that we don't want to have, I think they need to be asking the question about growth where and growth for what. And by the way, that is not only a discussion about emerging markets versus developed economies and so forth. Actually, when you decompose the United States as well, you need to be thinking actually the United States almost like you can decompose it and you can find very, very different levels of GDP per capita as well. So that is a very, very important discussion, but I would separate it to growth where and growth for what.
So we've talked a lot about organizations and businesses and the role that they need to play in moving us towards a more sustainable future. What about individuals? I mean, how significant is the role that we as individuals have to play, and do our actions really matter?
I think we have a huge role to play. Every time that you have a conversation with a colleague, with a friend, it actually makes a difference in the life of that person, right? And I think one of the things that we dramatically underestimate in society is the value of incremental change, which accumulates over time and creates very, very significant effects. And we dramatically overvalue the visibility and the impact that is coming from an effort for radical change. And the reason why I'm saying that is because many times actually incremental change over time accumulates on itself and creates a very, very significant effect. And many times actually radical change tries to do something radical, and sometimes it works, but oftentimes actually it fails and creates zero impact. And in different situations, you can actually try and pull different levers. And that to me goes to the perspective of the agency that we all have to actually make a change in our own organizations and accumulate that effect over time and diffuse actually some of those practices. So I think I fail to understand somehow that a narrative that sometimes gets created that somehow we are all hopeless in terms of having zero agency and having no impact actually, while in reality collectively we can have a tremendous impact. The question is how we can diffuse those practices and those behaviors across a large number of people. That is actually the collective action problem that we often have.
Well, thank you so much, George, for spending an hour with us. It was stimulating and fascinating as always. Go out and buy Purpose and Profit, How Business Can Lift Up the World. It's a terrific book. I enjoyed it tremendously and I highly recommend it. And follow the work that George is doing online. It's fascinating and cutting edge. So we're lucky to have you. Thanks for participating in another American Sustainability Network webinar. And we wish you the best with all the work that you're doing. Thank you so much, George.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for having me.
And if I can make one more statement, I put the link for George's book in the chat, and we'll be posting a recording of this session later online on the link I posted as well. And I just want to make a shout out, if you all are available, we would love to see all you attendees at the ASBN conference, which is happening November 30th to December 3rd in San Diego this year. Jeffrey will be there on the main stage interviewing Ryan Gellert, the CEO of Patagonia, and we have a lot more great sessions on the link I put in the chat of our agenda. So I would love to see you there. Thank you, everybody.